My neighbour has been cutting down trees all morning, which is maybe not the most auspicious start, but here we are, I guess. Hi, I'm Annabelle, and after maybe like a full year of debating starting to make YouTube content, I figured I should finally go for it. I've been making like short form book content on TikTok for a really long time, but I basically got sick of trying to cut down like hour-long clips into 3-minute videos. So it seemed appropriate to maybe go somewhere that could contain like the sheer quantity of my yap. I figured I'd start by talking about all of the 5-star reads I've had this year so far. I've had a pretty good reading year, but I'm in a really big slump at the minute, so I'm hoping that maybe like recapping some favourites will encourage me to seek out some new things and maybe get reading again and hopefully kick the slump. I don't know though, we'll see. It feels like this one might stick. Fruit of the Dead by Rachel Lyon is like the Hades and Persephone book to end all others. Truly, it feels like the only Greek myth retelling you ever need. This book casts Persephone as Corey, who's an 18-year-old camp counselor. She gets hired by the father of one of her campers as their nanny for the summer. He whisks her away to their private island and then gets her hooked on pain medication. I was really drawn to this book by the Ruth Gilligan quote that's on the cover. Ancient Greece meets Succession by way of Emma Cline, and that feels very, very apt. Reading this felt like watching a Sofia Coppola movie. It is like wealth and status and big pharma meets power and corruption and this very imbalanced relationship. It's told in this split narrative, so whilst Corey is getting drawn deeper and deeper into the web of everything that's happening on the island, her mother Ema is racing up and down the East Coast, losing more and more of herself as she's trying to find her daughter. It is just so fantastic. I couldn't put it down. It's like very, very atmospheric. It's such a long, hot summer book. And even while the two different storylines felt quite disparate from each other, they were very distinct in their tellings and in the voice. They were obviously very like inextricably linked. It felt like we were propelling towards this inevitable ending where the two were going to crash into one another. I loved it. I read it so fast, I could not get enough. I'm honestly a little bit mad at myself for not having read Open Water sooner. People have been recommending this to me for years. This is an absolutely gorgeously, poetically written love story about two young black artists who meet in London. It is a gorgeous celebration of everything it is to be black and British, as well as this really like tender portrayal of love and how scary it can be to kind of leap into something, especially when it's someone who you have a past friendship with, or like maybe things are a little bit more complicated. It was just so like moving and touching. Even though it's very, very short, it is an absolute powerhouse novel, and just every single choice of word was so lovely and lyrical. And even whilst it was like very hard-hitting and really emotionally powerful and quite fraught sometimes, every single page was just such a joy to get into. The Portrait of a Mirror is a very, very, very loose reimagining of the Narcissus myth as like a novel of manners. This sees two like New York high society art world couples sort of collide with one another as their business dealings become intermingled. There's a lot of like very weird interpersonal drama, and as much as like every single character is really dislikable, I kind of hated all of them. It was in a very like delightful way. I really enjoyed reading about them. The writing is super pretentious, and I say that in the best way. It is like overly wordy, really purple prose. There's so much to get your teeth into, but it was really enjoyable. And even whilst it's like very satirical and a real kind of skewering of like image obsessed art world culture, it also kind of felt like it led with a lot of empathy and compassion for these really horrible people. It reminded me of like, I don't know, there was that like Lady Gaga interview where she's like, I don't like her, I don't trust her, but I had to love her. That's how I felt about these characters. Anita de Monte Laughs Last is the second book by Cecile Gonzalez, who is very, very quickly becoming one of my favourite authors. Olga Dies Dreaming was a really firm favourite that I read last year, and this one might be better. This is another kind of art world book. This is about a student at Brown who is doing her thesis on this very, very famous male minimalist artist, and then she discovers that maybe he murdered his wife. She starts looking into his wife, Anita de Monte, and finds out that she was this incredible artist in her own right who has kind of been swept aside by history into the shadow of her husband. I adored this book. It's kind of inspired by a true story, and I think something that Cecile Gonzalez does so well is she writes this men who I absolutely despise with every fibre of my being, but they never feel kind of villainous. They are obviously the villain of the story, but they're not like mustachio twirling caricatures. They feel very real, and you can see exactly the systems that prop them up, exactly how they get their power, and you kind of understand why they do what they do to keep that power. It sort of makes me hate them all the more for it, but it just makes for like this real gut punch of a book. This is another one of like multiple timelines and narratives that always seems to be something I really enjoy, especially when it's handled as well as this. This also interweaves elements of Cuban folklore and spirituality, and it's just done so well. It's almost got like magical realist parts of it, which often I can kind of take or leave, but this was just sensational. If you would have told me at the start of the year that one of the best books I read would have been a romance novel about a time traveling apartment, I probably wouldn't have believed you, but that's just testament to like how good The 7-Year Slip is. This is about a young woman who goes to live in her great aunt's apartment and discovers that sometimes when she steps into it, she travels 7 years back in time, and she meets this man who's staying at the same apartment over that summer 7 years ago. I think that something Ashley Poston does so well is she writes these kind of high concept, almost paranormal romances, but they always feel really grounded. They're very much in service to the story and in service to character. Like, I don't feel there's any way you could have gotten the same character development in this book without the time traveling apartment. It felt very necessary. And it's just this lovely novel about letting go of things that maybe don't serve you anymore, especially those expectations that someone is going to be the same as they were a long time ago. It's about how people change and grow, and how, like, even though that's hard, it can also be a really good thing. It's also hilarious. It is so funny. I loved it, even when it made me cry. Possession by A.S. Byatt. I don't know if this is quite old enough to be considered like a true classic, but it's very much like a waiting game. This will absolutely be one. This is about two scholars investigating a possible link between these two Victorian poets and the connection they may have had. It's about the dark and messy politics of academia. It almost reads like a dark academia novel, which is very much my jam. There is so much to it. It is big and meandering and dense and so wordy and heavy. It took me a full month to read it, but I'm really glad that I did take my time, because I think this book needs to be read slowly and really savoured. There's so many different elements of it. It's layered with letters and poems and all of these different POVs from different characters who all have very conflicting interests. This book is like heartfelt and moving and profound, and also desperately sad. I wept through big passages of it, but I think it's like an absolute must read. Definitely one I'm going to pick up again, because I think there's going to be so many elements that I'm going to get from it more on the second time around, especially in regards to the poetry, because I'm not a big poetry person. It's a form I am not as familiar with, and so I think a lot of that probably went over my head. Chain Gang All Stars is an absolutely awe-inspiring book, and it's not really my usual thing. It's very genre. It's like a very literary dystopian horror almost. This is a vision of the American prison system where prisoners are given the kind of option to join this gladiatorial tournament where they fight to the death to try and earn their freedom. I think what makes this book so effective and also very eerie and unsettling is how much of it is rooted in our current reality. It feels like a very near future and very possible dystopia. It's about racism and the prison system and voyeurism and this kind of urge to make a spectacle out of people, and the way that the standards of earning forgiveness are very different depending on who you are. There are so many different like story threads in this, and so many things that could have been made a mess of or handled badly, but everything is just written with this kind of iron grit. It is all handled so perfectly and so intentionally, and even as I cried and some chapters made me feel like physically ill, it's also just packed with love and compassion. Every single character is so well realized and so well fleshed out, and I felt so deeply for every single one of them. It's just like, it's raw and unflinching and such an exciting talent. I can't say enough good things about this. I know it's been a bit Marmite-y, some people haven't been into it, but I say those people are wrong. Biography of X was a very recent read. I read this in July for my book club. This is another one that's been recommended to me a lot, and I am so glad I read it, and I'm so glad I read it slowly over the entire month, because it is like an absolute paradox and it's such an enigma. This is the fictionalized biography of this like iconoclast multi-medium artist named X, written by her widow after she dies. And it's just about her widow trying to unpick the threads of these many lives and many identities of X to maybe find the person that she was really married to. There's so much to get into here. There are so many layers. It's written kind of in our world, but in a very alternate version. So it's got these pop culture references, some of which are like super audacious. Catherine Lacey just throws in that like, oh yeah, X was in Berlin with Bowie and she wrote Heroes, as this very like by the by fact. I felt like a lot of it was like really ballsy. But the most thing I couldn't really unpick about it was my own feelings. I hated X, but I also loved her, and I understood why all these people were so drawn to her and so obsessed with her. I feel like if I would have met her, I would have felt the same way. I would have really craved her approval, as much as I can see that like she's a pretty terrible person sometimes. It's such a meandering book, and it just asks these questions about like, what is truth? What is identity? Who is a person? What can we make of ourselves and shape of our own identities? It's so brilliant. This is my first Catherine Lacey, but I went to the bookshop like after I finished this and I bought 3 more. These Stolen Lives is for anybody who is like back in their YA dystopia era. This is maybe the best YA dystopia I have ever read in my life. And I think it encapsulates everything that makes that genre so good. This is about a world where this colonizing force has come in, and the way that their society works is that people have to pay for the right to survive. But the indigenous people that live there and that survive this colonizing process are known as repayers. They owe back pay for the lives they lived prior to colonization. And so they essentially live as like indentured servants. This book follows Maura, who learns that one of her friends is going to be executed and makes it her mission to save him. Truly, it has got like everything you could want. It's got a heist. It's like an absolutely propulsive, can't put it down story. It has a tension-filled, slow burn romance. It's got all of this like incredible commentary on racism, colonialism, and late-stage capitalism. The writing is really lovely. Every word feels so carefully chosen. I think just Sharada Keats is such a talent. Mostly though, I need more people to read this because I am in like physical pain waiting for book 2, and I kind of want people that I can like suffer together with. But it's like, it's sensational. I'm so obsessed with it. The Prospect by Katie Hoffman is a rom-com about the first trans man in professional baseball who is playing on a minor league team when his college rival and his college teammate gets drafted onto that team, and obviously the season becomes a little bit messy. One thing I struggled with this is it is like a capital B baseball book. I didn't know enough about the sport and I really had to go away and research. I think in a lot of sports romances I've read, the sport is very, very secondary and it's just kind of the backdrop and the context for what's happening in the story. But in this, baseball is so integral. So much of the book is about them playing it together, the dynamics of the team and how their different baseball positions affect their interpersonal relationship and the way they interact with one another, which I really, really enjoyed. I didn't think that's something I'd been missing until I read it. Also, these boys, I love them so deeply. They're just like silly, dumb, anxious messes who are so obviously in love with each other, but they're like, oh no, Jean doesn't even like me. I love them. I would protect them with my life. It's hilarious. It's so moving. I loved reading it. It made me invest in a sport that I didn't think I had any interest in before. And I think it's like everything that makes a good sports romance great. Last but not least is Burnam Wood. This was actually my first 5-star read of the year. This is my first time reading Eleanor Catton, despite having owned all of her books for a long time. But by all accounts, this is very different to her previous 2 novels. This is kind of a very literary thriller about a group of guerrilla gardeners who pop up all over Australia planting community gardens. They then kind of get involved in this billionaire who on the surface like wants to invest and grow their organization, but actually maybe just wants to use them to cover up something he's got going on in a national park. This is like very witty. It has a very dark sense of humor, and I think the tone of it really feels like it will appeal to fans of Yellowface. It's got that energy of the kind of very unlikable, morally grey, not quite as morally grey as in Yellowface, main characters. It's that same like very sardonic, satirical novel. It is so fantastic. It's so pacey. It's got such bite to it. It's told from all of these different character POVs who all feel very, very distinct from one another, each with their own voice and their own motivations. But even whilst all of these different chapters feel quite disparate from one another, the novel as itself feels very, very cohesive. I loved this. I really love a literary thriller, and I think this is like a really fantastic one. It feels very prudent and very timely. It's about kind of greenwashing, corporate interests, the technology industry, big business, and also just like individuals who want to do a good thing but then kind of get swept up in their own mythology and their own ego. You just have to read it. You have to. It's so, so good. I think I can kick this reading slump soon so that I can like get back into reading great stuff and continue my excellent reading year. But I don't know, these have set the bar pretty high. They're gonna be hard to top. Also, this slump feels pretty persistent. I think it might stick around for a while, which is not an excellent way to start a booktube channel, but I guess I'm gonna do it anyway. If you wanna stick around, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it. I don't know fully what this channel is gonna look like. I obviously do a lot of reading and I love making book content, but I also love knitting and writing and wearing pretty vintage dresses. So maybe it'll be a bit of everything. We'll see. Okay, bye.